Hi, I'm Mimi Geerges. Foreign correspondents depend on fixers to translate for them, provide access to local populations, and act as guides. But in Iraq and Syria, that can be a very dangerous job.
Her house had been firebombed before that, but when she received a letter by someone who said, for your own safety, you should leave with your children. Don't sleep in your home tonight. Then she knew she was next.
Welcome to the Mimi Geerges Show. Like many English speakers in Iraq during the American-led invasion, Ahlam offered to work with the Americans to help translate and get services for her fellow Iraqis. But that work wasn't appreciated by the militias, and she and her family were forced to flee to Syria. It wasn't long before she was once again helping Iraqi refugees and working as a fixer for Western journalists. Deborah Campbell is one of those journalists who worked with Ahlam and became a close friend. She was with her when Syrian agents arrested her. Deborah's book is called A Disappearance in Damascus, Friendship and Survival in the Shadow of War. Deborah, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
You went to Syria in 2007 to report on Iraqi refugees who had fled to Syria. Why did you go undercover? Why didn't you let it be known that you were a journalist?
It's a decision that I've made based on experience. I've often found that when you're going into countries where the government is suspicious of journalists, that applying for a journalist visa immediately puts you on the radar. You are followed, your sources are followed, your phone is watched, your computer is watched. Then often you're restricted in where you can go and how long you can stay. And the kind of work that I like to do is immersive journalism. So that means spending a lot of time not parachuting in for 2 or 3 days, but actually spending weeks, months in a place and getting really close to the people I'm writing about. And in order to do that, I need the freedom of movement that going undercover gave me. So in a sense, I was hiding in plain sight because I went as an academic, which I do teach at a university. This gave me the freedom to go wherever I liked and talk to whomever I liked without that constant sense of looking over your shoulder.
So why is working with foreign journalists not allowed in Syria during that time for the fixer?
For the fixer. So for example, now Ahlam was a fixer for a lot of the major news media, including the BBC, Al Jazeera, Australian and French television, but she didn't do it by registering with the Ministry of Information in Damascus. If you were an official fixer, quote unquote, you were registered, and it meant that you would most likely be asked, where did the journalist go? What did the journalist ask? Who did they talk to? That sort of thing. So it was more like having a minder than having a fixer. And those who worked with Ahlam, because she was freelance, she was doing her work without that kind of registration, you just felt that you could trust that what you were doing was in confidence. And at the same time, of course, that put her on the radar.
What was the Syrian regime afraid of? Why did they need to follow foreign journalists? What were they worried would happen?
So I was there in 2007 and 2008. This was 3, 4, 5 years after the invasion. They had had 1.5 million Iraqis come into the country in a very short period of time, most in the city of Damascus. And the great fear of the Syrian government was that their war would follow them to Syria. And generally speaking, Syrians themselves were very worried about this. The war was so close to them. They are a multicultural country, similar in makeup in that respect to Iraq, and there was a feeling that if the war could happen there, it may well come to Syria. There was also a great anxiety that after the invasion of Iraq, that Syria could be next.
So maybe the Syrian regime could have not facilitated all those fighters going into Iraq and fighting the Americans. But that's a subject for another program. Mm-hmm. Could the Iraqis that went to Syria, could they work? Could their children go to school?
The children were able to go to school. Whether they did or not depended on a number of things. Did they have their documents? A lot of the schools had been destroyed. If they'd missed 3 or 4 years of school, like a lot of them did, most of them were, say they're 16 years old, weren't necessarily wanting to go into the 6th grade. But more often than not, the children were working because it was illegal for foreigners to work in Syria. So they didn't have work permits. They had essentially tourist visas. They were guests. Legally they couldn't work. There was a lot of black market labor going on. So Iraqis were willing to work for about half of what a Syrian would work for. So you did see a lot of, and by the way, these Iraqis were the professional class. So you had teachers, professors, doctors, accountants, lawyers, and willing to work for, say, $100 a month painting houses in Damascus. So they did do that.
Was that the kind of jobs that they would get?
That's the kind of jobs that they would get, largely labor jobs. For women, it would often be more desperate. So there was an enormous sex trade going on. So you had widows who were feeding their children this way. It would be women, girls who were supporting their families. Some were being trafficked by their families, and the third category were organized gangs that were trafficking girls.
How did Syrians react to this influx of Iraqis? Did they resent them?
They had mixed feelings. On the one hand, there was a lot of sympathy. They knew what the war was, so they felt sorry for Iraqis, a lot the way a lot of us do for Syrians today, ironically. At the same time, it meant massive inflation. When you have a city of 3 or 4 million that population rises by 1 million in a year and a half, suddenly rents were skyrocketing, housing prices tripled, food prices went way up. It was hyperinflation. Now, this was good for business if you, say, were a landlord, if you were a real estate developer, if you owned a business. But if you were among the working poor, it meant that suddenly your rent tripled. Suddenly the price of produce tripled. So there was that, and there was also a fear of rising crime rates, anxiety about also Iraqis taking jobs because they were willing to work for a pittance.
Ahlam had become kind of this unofficial leader of the Iraqi refugee community in Damascus. Mm-hmm. Tell us about her background, her character.
Very unusual person. What struck me right away was her charisma and her leadership abilities. So while she was working as a fixer for foreign correspondents, she was doing that to both feed her family, her 2 children and her husband, and also to finance her social projects. So she was a repository, a kind of conduit of donations when people would donate clothing or food. And also she started to run a small school out of her apartment because, as I said, although Syrian children or Iraqi children were allowed to go to schools, often these schools were very overcrowded. A lot of people didn't go because the kids were working, or especially with their girls, they were a little nervous about predators. They were worried about being in a new place. So she opened a school for teenage Iraqi girls, and also to give them a sense of community so they could be around other girls who were going through similar things. So
a lot of people talk about doing stuff like that, but she actually did it.
She actually did it, and she had a very unusual upbringing that set her apart. She had grown up in a small village northwest of Baghdad, and she was the first girl of her village ever to go to high school, the first male or female ever to graduate from university. And when the men of the village came to her father and said, well, what need does she have to go to high school, go to university, when she's just going to be working the orange trees? They're an agricultural area like the other girls. He said her father happened to be the sheikh of the village, so he had a lot of power. And he said, nobody knows what the future holds. He felt that the world was changing, that women were taking their place in higher professions, and he was very proud of her. She was a great reader, she was very, very clever, and he fully supported her going to high school. So this actually set her apart from her community, but it also gave her a lot of skills that she could use later, and a great sense of empathy for the teenage girls that she saw who would have gone on to high school, would have gone on to university if not for the war, because that was becoming normal. Iraq was the most educated country in the Middle East up until the invasion, and she wanted to do what she could to step into the gap.
What was she doing before the U.S.-led invasion in 2003?
She was working partly as a fixer already since the 1990s, really. I mean, prior to the invasion, there had been international sanctions against Iraq. It was assumed that they would pressure Saddam Hussein into acquiescing, also punish him for the invasion of Kuwait. But like a lot of sanctions, what ends up happening is it weakens the middle class. Essentially, it eradicated the middle class. People became either rich or poor. And people who knew how to work the system, the few that could, did very well. There was a great rise in corruption. But also, I mean, it did bring a lot of foreign journalists to Iraq, and she began working as a fixer. Her older brother was also doing the same. That was where she got her start. She had studied English after university, and so this became her, she became almost like a go-between between Iraqi civilians and the outside world.
So what happened when U.S. troops came to town?
Well, a number of things happened. I mean, the war came to her village in a sense, because people began to flee her village. She stayed, even though it was very close to Baghdad. And at first there were soldiers who were fleeing from the Iraqi army. And these weren't soldiers the way we think of them. They were sort of 18-year-old boys who had been drafted with no training, and their commanders had run for their lives, essentially, when the Americans showed up with this enormous army. And so they were on their own, and she hid them for a while and helped to smuggle them out across the river so they could escape with their lives. And then very soon, American troops arrived in her village, and they found, to their great surprise, a woman speaking English. And so her home became almost a kind of an outreach base for them. They started to come over, they brought medical help. She was able to go to them with problems that were happening in her village, and whether it was the cluster bombs that were all over the fields, or the medical problems, the lack of electricity, bad water, all of these problems that come along with war. And soon enough, she became a conduit there between the military and the civilian needs.
Why did she get kidnapped, and by who?
Well, at first she was working for the Wall Street Journal as a fixer for the first few months of the war. And after the reporter she was working for left, she began working for a U.S. Civil Military Affairs center that was in her district. And she was also a city councilor for Baghdad. And so this really put her, again, on the radar. She became known, she was very active, she was really involved in advocating for the civilian population. And about 2 years after the war began, she'd had some threats on her life. Became rather common to get these kinds of threats, especially if you were in any way linked to the Americans. And letters had arrived. There was graffiti in her neighborhood with her name on it.
But didn't that scare her enough to get her out of there, or she was like, yeah, whatever?
Well, she has always been this person who does what she feels is the right thing to do in the moment. Whether it's the safest thing to do is, there was really no safety at that time. No place was safe. So she felt as if her work was important and it mattered. And also that these threats were so widespread that she took her chances. It was when finally she got a message, a letter sent to her by someone who said, I respect the work that you do. For your own safety, you should leave tonight with your children. Don't sleep in your home tonight. And she'd previously had her house had been firebombed before that. But when she received a letter that wasn't threatening her, but was warning her, then she knew that she was next. So that's when she decided to leave. She left temporarily, but she ended up going back because of the problems it created by fleeing it for the rest of her family. It made her look like she had some reason to be fleeing. And so she ended up being kidnapped on her way to work.
By who?
By, as it turned out, an Al-Qaeda linked group.
And they kidnapped her just because she was working with the enemy, the Americans, and they wanted to punish her, or what were they looking for?
They wanted information, first of all. They saw her as a high-value prisoner, and they wanted information on troop maneuvers. Her myth essentially was bigger than what she was up to, which was, rebuilding schools and helping people get medical care and helping prisoners' families find their loved ones. So they were going to kill her, actually, until they actually one of the captors began to call through the names on her phone, one by one, talking to the orphans and widows that she had worked for. And when they did that, he decided to allow her her family to pay a ransom for her life.
And they did.
They did.
And at that point, she realized she needed to get out and go to Syria.
Yes.
So while she was in Damascus, she was followed by Syrian intelligence. Why would they follow her? I mean, again, she's not a spy. She's not working against the regime.
Well, first of all, her connection to Western journalists made her an object of scrutiny. And secondly, she was a woman who was active. And she was constantly having people come through her apartment day and night, people asking for help, asking for advice. Her father, as I said, had been the sheikh of her village and ran the kind of, essentially the town hall for her village as the mayor, almost more than a mayor. And she did very similar kind of work in Damascus. So when I would spend time with her, I'd often go to her apartment and there'd be a dozen people coming through in the course of an hour and a half, and this made her an object of suspicion. So she noticed that a man was camped outside of her apartment building, taking photographs of her when she came and went. She noticed that she was being followed when she went to buy groceries. And at first she thought, maybe this is my kidnappers. Maybe they've come to follow me here. There were militias that were doing that kind of thing. Because once they kidnap you and get a ransom, you're like a bank machine. They can come after you again. But when she was finally called into Syrian intelligence for her neighborhood, the head of intelligence said to her, who is this woman about whom I've heard so much? We've sent 3 men to follow you and they can't keep up. And she said, they must be out of shape.
She's a bit sassy, isn't she?
She was always like that, yeah.
So you were in her apartment that day when she got taken?
I was, yes. So this was about 9 months after we had met. We'd been working together for many months. And I knew that she'd been called in for questioning many times. And I was very worried about her. So at this point, I was actually living in her neighborhood, which was strictly a refugee neighborhood. And I had gone over that morning. She was like the center of news, too. So if you wanted to know what was going on on any given day, it was all coming through her. So I went over to her place as usual in the morning to get the latest update. And it was a strange thing because, that sense when someone's following you, you can feel it on the back of your neck, or when someone's watching you. I had this feeling that I was being watched, and
in fact you were.
And in fact I was, yes. But I was the only Westerner living in this neighborhood. I worked undercover a lot, and I know that you can be a little bit paranoid when you're doing this. So I thought, okay, it's probably nothing. But about 15 minutes after I arrived at her apartment, there was a knock at the door.
And they took her, they said, it's just going to be for a few questions, but it wasn't. She was taken to jail, she was interrogated. What were they asking her? What were her interrogators wanting to know from her?
They immediately wanted her to work for them. They wanted her to be a spy. It was something they had suggested in the past, something that she had refused. They thought to them, they said to her, well, you were a spy for the Americans, now it's your turn to spy for us. And so she rejected that view of the work that she was doing. But nuance isn't something that works very well in those situations. They wanted her to spy specifically on a specific journalist and also to look at what the UN was doing. She was working as a neighborhood representative for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and she refused.
She could have easily just kind of gone along with that,
A
given them
lot
a
of
little bit of information here and there, nothing of consequence. I mean, she was separated from her kids at this point.
She was separated from her children, and they were 9 and 11. They were little kids, so she was terrified for them. But her view of it was if she gave in at any one point, it would never end.
So it was about 4 months that she was held in prison?
It was 5 months
5
altogether.
months. How did she get out in the end?
Well, that's a good question. It's something that I investigate in the book. So after she was taken, I was at her apartment, and all of this took place in front of me. The man who came to arrest her told her to get rid of me. As soon as I saw him, I knew who he was. I mean, he wasn't even wearing a uniform, but you know those people that always look like they're in uniform. She said, "Okay, I'm just going to be gone for a few hours. Go now." And it was in some ways the calmness with which she responded to this that told me that something was very wrong. So I left, and I was in a position where I'm a journalist, so what I do is look for answers to my questions. So I was left with all these questions, and also a sense that, okay, she's been followed, she's been arrested, maybe I'm the cause. Maybe her connection to me as an undercover journalist has put her in danger. Or maybe it's the other journalists that she's worked for, and I happen to know a lot of them, and I knew the stories that she was working on. Or maybe it's her work for the UNHCR that's done it. And so I was, and a lot of the book is written like a detective novel, because you're looking for these answers. And these were the questions that I had. Why has she been taken? Where has she been taken? What are they doing to her? And how can we get her out? And I had to do it, again, even more of an undercover situation, because
right, because you could make things worse.
I could make things worse. If they knew that she was working with me undercover, this would confirm any suspicions that they had that she wasn't being upfront with them. And put her in more danger. And it could also, if I wrote a big article and had it published everywhere, it could make her a kind of high-value prisoner. And whereas there was a possibility that they might decide there's nothing here, let's just let her go. So these were all the questions that I was...
So happily, she's released and she's given asylum in the United States. Her and her children go. And
remarkably, yes.
Yes. How is she doing now? I mean, it's been a while, but...
It has. So, there have been definitely ups and downs. She was very fortunate to land in a community in North Chicago that has been so supportive, so welcoming to both her and to her children. And I don't actually know how she would have done if she didn't have so many good people around her. And Americans that have stepped in to help her find work, to help her, and help her children as well. I mean, her daughter is 18 now. She's doing pre-med, University of Illinois. And her daughter's, one of Ahlam's good American friends went and hired an SAT coach for her. The things that most refugees don't have, right? And she's a very bright girl. She probably could have done well on her own, but I don't know if she would have had 6 scholarship offers.
Deborah, I want to ask you about something you wrote in the book, because you had written a lot about the Iraqi refugees in Syria and the situation there. And you said, quote, "The article I had written had received some attention, created a ripple, but in the end it had accomplished nothing because it could not roll back time." Did you feel like all that work that you were doing didn't really accomplish anything?
I think when one becomes a journalist, you do it because you think you can make a change. And in the face of the juggernaut of war, you may be able to document for posterity. You may be able to right some wrong impressions and bring factual discussion to the table, but you can't turn back time. And having met so many people who suffered so outrageously, I often felt as if words were helpless in the face of this. In fact, one of the pieces of advice that really helped me post that sort of existential crisis, which I think a lot of writers and journalists face, is speaking to another writer. When I started to write this book, I said, I feel as if writing can't change the world. It's not possible anymore. The conversation is so fragmented now. People are in their filter bubbles. It's so difficult to penetrate the conversation. And he said, Deborah, the point of writing is not to change the world. He said, it's to keep the truth alive.
Deborah, thanks so much for being on the program. This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. You can also subscribe to our new podcast on iTunes. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.